Hey, what's up guys, Sukhdeep here. So I've been using the new M4 iPad Pros for over the past week now, and this is my review. So I've got both the 11 and 13-inch iPad Pros in space black, and one of the very first things I noticed was just how big that 13-inch model is. It really does feel like you're holding a television in your hands, is the best way I can describe it. But one of the advantages of these new iPad Pros is that they are significantly thinner. So the 11-inch model is just 5.3 millimeters thick, and the 13-inch model is even slimmer at just 5.1 millimeters, making it the slimmest product Apple has ever made, even slimmer than the Apple Pencil itself. Now, I know a lot of people on the internet have been joking about whether or not Apple are just making their product slimmer for the sake of it, because realistically, I don't think any of us actually asked for the iPads to become any slimmer. But after using both devices for the past week, I think that the change definitely was worth it. It just makes the devices so much easier to hold in your hand as a tablet, and by reducing the thickness, the iPads have also gotten somewhat lighter as well. So the 13-inch model now weighs just 1.5 pounds compared to 1.8 pounds previously, and the 11-inch weighs just 0.9 pounds compared to 1.1 pounds before. And on top of that, because the new Magic keyboards are also a bit lighter, the overall iPad and Magic keyboard setup now weighs much less. It's especially noticeable on that smaller 11-inch model, which feels barely noticeable when I'm carrying it around. The 13-inch model though is still quite heavy. I've never used the larger iPad sizes before, but the best way I can describe it is it feels similar to holding my M1 MacBook Air when connected with the Magic Keyboard, and it still is quite cumbersome to hold when you're using it as a tablet. So if you were previously on the fence about the size difference, I'm not sure that the weight reduction and slimmer design will sway you. Another design change Apple have made is that they have finally moved the webcam and Face ID cameras from the top onto the sides of the display. Although the cameras aren't actually placed in the middle of the display, they're slightly off center to allow for the new Apple Pencil charger to fit in. But the important thing is that you no longer have to worry about looking off to the side when you're on video calls, and unlocking the iPad with Face ID is now much easier since your thumbs aren't as likely to cover the sensors anymore. Also, the space black iPads are now a few shades darker than the old space grey colour, which I'm a huge fan of. They do collect a lot of fingerprints though, so if you're somebody who likes to keep their products in pristine condition, you may want to opt for the silver colour this year. But, personally, I'm all for them making the iPads darker. I'd really love to see them make a jet black iPad model one day. Now, one design change that I'm not a huge fan of is the layout of the new camera bump on the back. So Apple have removed the ultra-wide camera, presumably because not many people were using it and they wanted to keep the cost down. And they've replaced it with an adaptive True Tone flash that uses AI to remove the shadows of any documents you're scanning, which admittedly seems like quite a niche use case, putting in a new piece of hardware in just for that. However, the issue I have is that the layout of the camera bump now looks a bit of a mess, because if you take a look properly, you've got all of these different circles that are all different sizes. And yeah, it just looks a lot less organized compared to the old camera bump layout. But to be honest, it's just a minor nitpick. Otherwise, in terms of design, I think this might be it for the iPad. I don't really see what else Apple can do to take this design any further. I know some people have asked for slimmer bezels, but when you think about it, on the tablet, you technically need the bezels so that you can hold it without triggering the screen by mistake. So yeah, I think this might just be peak design for the iPad. Now, one of the most noticeable upgrades for the new iPad Pros this year is their new tandem OLED screens, which Apple is marketing as an Ultra Retina XDR display. Essentially, OLED allows for much better contrast, significantly higher dynamic range, and deeper blacks when viewing content, and I can definitely notice the difference when comparing it against my 11-inch M1 iPad Pro, which was using an LCD display. It's kind of hard to describe in words, but the best way I can put it is that the colors just look a lot more vibrant and lively. Not necessarily saturated, but everything just looks sharper and pops out a lot more, especially because the brightness has also been increased. So the previous iPad Pros could only achieve up to 600 nits of brightness, but these new OLED iPad Pros can reach up to 1000 nits of SDR and HDR brightness, and up to 1600 nits of peak HDR brightness. And yeah, the difference is definitely noticeable. If you're somebody who likes to use their iPad outdoors in the sunlight, content is just going to be a lot easier and more comfortable to view. The only thing to note though is that when it gets really hot, the iPad's display will still dim in order to prevent the device from overheating. Now, Apple have upgraded the thermal cooling system on the back to try and counteract this, but it's something to bear in mind. There is also a nanotexture option for this display too, but you have to upgrade to either the 1TB or 2TB storage options before paying an additional $100 for it. And that's because it's really made for users who are using their iPads all day outdoors, who need accurate colors and no reflections. But for the average consumer, I wouldn't recommend getting the nano texture option, especially because it can actually reduce some of the contrast you get and worsen the quality of the display. So overall, I'd say that the new OLED screens are going to be the biggest reason for anybody to upgrade to the M4 iPad Pros this year. Yeah, they're just incredible. Also, a fun fact, these new iPad Pro wallpapers actually spell out the word Pro, which is pretty cool. Now, another headlining feature of these iPad Pros is that they come with Apple's M4 chip, which is meant to be their first sort of proper AI chip, I guess you could say. It has a beefed up neural engine for processing AI tasks, 50% more CPU performance, and a GPU that's 4 times more powerful compared to the M2 chip that was in the previous iPad Pro. Now, technically, there aren't that many applications that can take full advantage of the M4 chip, let alone the previous M2. And there is that saying that most people who own a 4x4 are never really going to take them off the road. And I feel like with the iPad Pro, it's a similar case where most people buying this device probably aren't going to be taking full advantage of all of the raw power inside of this machine. If you're just using your iPad for web surfing, replying to emails, or watching my YouTube videos, the days of us needing more power on the iPad for that are long behind us. However, I can see this being beneficial if you're somebody who does a lot of creative work, like video editing or 3D design. Personally, I don't do either of those on my iPad, but I have recently started getting into photo editing. And I have noticed that the M4 iPad Pros are able to load up ProRAW images a bit faster than my M1 iPad, and edits are usually applied a lot quicker. That said, if I am adding in effects like masking in Lightroom, the iPad will occasionally heat up, especially on the 11-inch model, to the point where there have actually been a few cases where I've had to take a pause from photo editing on the iPad because it was just getting too warm, which makes sense because there are obviously no fans inside of these iPads to cool them. And yeah, the fact that Apple have been able to fit in this much computing power into such a slim form factor still amazes me. Overall though, I can see the inclusion of the M4 chip being beneficial when it comes to future-proofing this device. If you take a look at what Apple have done with external monitor support, they've restricted it exclusively to the M series iPads. And I feel like Apple are going to be doing a lot more ring fencing when it comes to some of the new AI features going forward. And having the latest chipset just means that you get a bit more headwind, which for a device costing over $1,000 is what you want. Another thing to note as well is that because the M4 chips are more efficient, the iPad is still able to retain its 10 hours of battery rating. However, the downside is that the iPad's battery rating has increased, which means that you will likely still need to charge it at least once during the day if you're using it intensively for work, unfortunately. A side benefit though is that we can now finally view the iPad's battery capacity and the number of charge cycles in the settings app, like you can on the iPhone 15s. And you can even set a limit to stop your iPad charging past 80%. So if you're somebody who constantly uses their iPad hooked up to an external display, and you're worried about the constant charging potentially damaging your battery health, you don't have to worry about that as much anymore. So that's something I thought I'd point out. Also, the charging cables are now braided to match the color of the iPad, and this space black cable is absolutely gorgeous. So, do I recommend you go out and purchase an M4 iPad Pro? Well, I think it really comes down to how much you care about that new OLED screen and the new accessories like the Magic Keyboard and the Apple Pencil Pro. Obviously, the iPads have gotten a lot more expensive this year. The base model 11-inch starts off at $999, and the 13-inch is even more expensive at $1,299. Now, to be fair, Apple have bumped up the storage from 128 to 256 gigabytes, but even still, these are pretty expensive devices. And yeah, I'm just not sure I would really recommend them to your average consumer. But I think if you just want the most premium tablet experience possible, or if you're able to write off the iPad as sort of a business expense, then yeah, I think the upgrade is definitely worth it, especially if you're coming from one of those older 11-inch iPad Pros with an LCD display. But again, it really is sort of a luxury in the same way that flying first class or purchasing a new car is a luxury. And it's not going to fundamentally change the experience of using an iPad. Everything that this M4 iPad Pro can do, my previous M1 could do too. It's just that the M4 does it a bit nicer. But then again, this could all change after WWDC, depending on what new software features Apple introduces. So if you are on the fence about upgrading, it might be worth waiting until June the 10th before making your purchasing decision. In the meantime, you can check out my review for the new Magic Keyboard cases in the description down below. Consider leaving a like if this video was helpful, and subscribe for the next one.